Kneel at the edge of a pool and look down. You'll see the surface of the water and your own reflection. Likewise, when we first read the Bible, we understand the immediate sense of the words. Reflected back at us also will be the assumptions and preconceptions we bring with us to the text. I'm Darek Barefoot, and by now you may know that typologetics is the attempt to identify, as objectively as possible, patterns that lie below the surface of the text, patterns that unify the Bible in surprising ways. Surprising because these patterns span biblical documents by different authors from different periods who wrote for slightly different purposes and with different audiences in mind. No ordinary collection of literature would be likely to have them. Their presence would make sense if the Bible is a divine revelation, and God really has reached out to enliven human hearts and the universe itself through the sacrificial life and death of Jesus Christ. In the first video of this series, I presented what I referred to as the principle of confirmed testimony. According to the law of Moses, in the first 5 books of the Bible, a lone witness is not sufficient to prove a case. The testimony of 2 or 3 is required. We also saw that witnesses, in the broadest sense, could include items of evidence, even quotations from the Old Testament, which are treated as miniature affidavits by the authors of New Testament books. We learned that key groups of witnesses exhibited a pattern that I've called the pair plus one, a trio, 2 members of which are closely linked to each other, while the remaining member stands slightly apart. Oddly enough, this pattern is reflected even by the passages that express the principle of confirmed testimony in the opening sections of the Old and New Testaments. How deeply is the pair plus one pattern embedded in the Bible? In what other instances does it stretch across different documents? To find out, we'll need to examine in detail one of the events witnessed by Jesus' inner circle of disciples. If you recall, the group included Peter along with the sons of Zebedee, James and John. One evening, Jesus leads the 3 up the side of a mountain. They stop to rest, and as the disciples become drowsy, they are startled to see Jesus' face and clothing begin to glow with supernatural light. He is transformed or transfigured in front of them, which is why the episode is known as the Transfiguration. Out of nowhere, next to Jesus appear 2 other men, whom the disciples somehow recognize as Moses and Elijah, figures from Israel's ancient past, who begin to speak to Jesus. A cloud envelops all of them, and the disciples hear what seems to be the voice of God Himself declaring that Jesus is His Son. As quickly as it began, the episode ends, and Peter, James, and John find themselves alone with Jesus. As they return, Jesus tells the disciples not to disclose what they've seen until after His impending death and resurrection. The disciples were intended to see Moses and Elijah as witnesses to the identity of Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, the Lord and Savior of Israel. They were witnesses as well to the necessity of His martyrdom. We know that because Luke's Gospel says that Moses and Elijah were heard speaking to Jesus about His coming departure from Jerusalem. According to Matthew, Jesus referred to what the disciples experienced as a vision. We read about visions and prophetic dreams elsewhere in the Bible, where they function as symbolic representations of reality. Examples are scattered from Genesis and the rest of the Old Testament through to Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. In the context of a vision, Moses, the lawgiver, would represent the Torah, the first section of the Hebrew Bible. In Acts 15:21, the Torah is simply called Moses. Elijah, the most famous prophet in Israel's history, would stand for the Nevi'im, the prophetic Hebrew writings that follow the Torah. Early in his ministry, Jesus said that the line of ancient prophets culminated in John the Baptist, who was a kind of new Elijah. Jesus made a similar comment as he talked with the disciples on the way back from the mountain. The message of the vision, then, is that both the Torah and the prophetic portion of the Hebrew Bible testify to Jesus. They contain certain prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. Beyond that, they have themes that point toward the kind of Messiah Jesus would prove to be. He would be like Joseph, the persecuted but forgiving brother we meet in Genesis. He would also be like Moses, the unlikely liberator and covenant mediator. He would make known God's will despite adversity, the way faithful kings and prophets had. Like Israel's Lord, he would endure the scorn of those he was trying to save. What the Transfiguration dramatizes is stated plainly in verses of the New Testament. Do not think that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets. I have not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Matthew 5:17. And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, Jesus expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Luke 24:27. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found the one about whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." John 1:45. Having therefore obtained help from God, I continue until this day, witnessing to both small and great, saying nothing other than what the prophets and Moses said would happen, that Christ should suffer, and that he should be the first that should rise from the dead, and should proclaim light to the people and to the Gentiles. Acts 26:22. But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. Romans 3:21-22. The last passage from Romans 3 tells us directly that the law and prophets are witnesses to spiritual truth about Jesus. Within the vision on the mountain, at the innermost layer, so to speak, we find a trio of witnesses to the messianic identity of Jesus, consisting of the lawgiver Moses, the prophet Elijah, and God, whose voice is heard as the vision concludes. Just outside is a second layer with our trio of apostolic witnesses, Peter, James, and John. Both trios exhibit the pair plus one pattern, as this diagram illustrates. We can step outward one more layer, however. The Transfiguration is not recorded in the fourth Gospel, John, but only in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It happens that those first three New Testament documents are referred to by scholars as the synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic means together seeing, because Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a common outline of Jesus' ministry distinct from that of John. The synoptic Gospels are a trio of documentary witnesses to the Transfiguration. And as you might guess, within this trio is a pair, Matthew and Luke. Each of those books is bracketed by an infancy narrative near the beginning and resurrection appearances of Jesus at the conclusion. Each provides a genealogy of Jesus. In common, they contain certain sayings and events called cue material, such as the Sermon on the Mount. Just as important, both are secondary to Mark. That is, the authors of Matthew and Luke appear to have used Mark as one of their sources. We can't come up with a set of features that links together as tightly any other two of the four Gospels. As we assemble these sets of witnesses, all of which conform to the pair plus one pattern, look what emerges. We have incidentally created still another layer, consisting of the first three categories or layers of testimony we've so far discovered. The visionary and apostolic trios both exist within the Bible narrative, while the synoptic trio exists outside it. This complex of nested trios is one of those surprising patterns we've been searching for. It makes creative sense for a story that testifies so dramatically to the messianic identity of Jesus to be saturated with the principle of confirmed testimony. Yet the more we learn about the origins of the New Testament and the early church, the harder it is to explain this patterned structure. Each of the four evangelists was in control of the gospel he wrote. None of them, however, could control which or how many gospel accounts would be regarded as authoritative decades later. The presence within the New Testament of a synoptic trio consisting of Matthew, Mark, and Luke is purely accidental from a historical point of view. The overwhelming preponderance of evidence is that the New Testament as we know it came together gradually as the most popular and respected documents spread from church to church and city to city. Gospels and apostolic letters were placed together on shelves and in cabinets long before they were bound together in a single book. Once again, the only alternative to coincidence appears to be divine orchestration of history, including the creation of certain documents and their incorporation into the Bible canon. We can defer judgment on the question a bit longer because the transfiguration narratives haven't yet given up all their secrets. You might remember that in the last video, I said it was obvious that Peter, James, and John were chosen to be witnesses to certain events, one of those being the transfiguration. It's a reasonable inference, since Jesus indicated to those men that eventually they should tell others about what they'd seen. Still, I didn't then cite the biblical reference that explicitly describes the trio as witnesses. It's from the New Testament book of 2 Peter. That book begins, Simon Peter, a servant and an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who have obtained a like precious faith with us through the righteousness of God and our Savior Jesus Christ. 2 Peter 1:1. The passage we're interested in occurs just a few verses later. For we did not follow cunningly devised fables when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received from God the Father honor and glory, when there came such a voice to him from the excellent glory, This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. And this voice which came from heaven we heard when we were with him in the holy mountain. 2 Peter 1:16-18. The author, who claims to be the Apostle Peter, says that he and others of similar authority were eyewitnesses to Jesus' splendor at the Transfiguration. They heard the voice of God testifying to Jesus' identity. From the Synoptic Gospels, we learn that James and John were the other members of the group. Some scholars have raised questions about the authorship of 2 Peter. We don't have to deal with those concerns here. We've found a place in New Testament literature where Peter and his companions that night are designated as witnesses. Whatever else might be suggested about 2 Peter, it wasn't written to buttress the literary architecture we've been studying. It does that only incidentally. What 2 Peter also confirms is that the voice from heaven is the culmination and centerpiece of the vision on the mountain. The Torah and the messages of the prophets, whether spoken or written, all are purported to come from God. The voice was direct divine testimony, compared with the indirect testimony represented by Moses and Elijah. The claim that God himself had borne witness that the man Jesus was, in the most exalted possible sense, God's own Son, is central to New Testament teaching. Consider the words of 1 John. If we accept the witness of men, the witness of God is greater. For this is the witness of God, which he has testified concerning his Son. 1 John 5:9. The general witness or testimony of God crystallizes, becomes clear and unmistakable when the voice from heaven is heard. Before following up on this clue, we need to pause and determine whether the principle of confirmed testimony is confined to groups of witnesses and items of evidence. Could it apply to multiple actions or declarations that establish a crucial fact? 2 or 3 instances instead of 2 or 3 witnesses? Part of the answer is in the Old Testament story of Joseph. Joseph, the great-grandson of Abraham, was sold into slavery by his jealous older brothers. In Egypt, he was imprisoned on false charges, but his ability to interpret dreams brought him to the attention of Pharaoh. Pharaoh had been disturbed by a dream in which he saw 7 healthy cows, followed by 7 bony, emaciated cows. He further dreamed of 7 healthy ears of grain, followed by 7 withered ears. Joseph says the dream is a divine warning, and then gives the interpretation. Behold, there will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, and there shall arise after them 7 years of famine. And all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land. And the plenty shall not be remembered in the land by reason of the famine following, for it shall be very severe. And insofar as the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice, the matter is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Genesis 41:28-32. God's announcement of the coming famine, first through the symbolism of the cows, and again by that of the ears of grain, confirmed its inevitability. Further evidence comes from a New Testament passage in which the author of the book of Hebrews reflects on another patriarchal story in Genesis. When the man Abraham was called by God to leave his home in Mesopotamia, God promised that Abraham's descendants would become numerous and inherit the land of Canaan just east of the Mediterranean. Later, when Abraham was willing to entrust God with the life of his young son, Isaac, God took an oath that he would act to fulfill his promise. For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, "Surely in blessing I will bless you, and in multiplying I will multiply you." In this manner God, desiring to show further to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his intention, confirmed it by an oath, that by 2 unchangeable things, in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have a strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold upon the hope set before us. Hebrews 6:13-18. The 2 unchangeable things are the initial promise first made to Abraham in Genesis 12:2-3, and the oath spoken in Genesis 22:16-18. God's restatement of his pledge, in a slightly different form, is understood to confirm it. Now, the principle of confirmed testimony requires 2 witnesses or 3. Is that also the case with repeated declarations? In Acts chapter 10, the Apostle Peter falls into a trance and sees a vision. A scene appears in front of him, and a voice gives him a command. The scene and the command occur twice more, 3 times in all, to make clear their importance. We also ought to look at an incident that took place earlier, shortly before Jesus' death. According to the Gospels, on Jesus' final night with his disciples, he announces that all of them will abandon him during the coming test. He even predicts that Peter, the spokesman for the 12, will deny knowing him. When Jesus is taken into custody, the apostles do flee after a brief scuffle with the arrest party. Peter and another disciple return and follow at a distance in order to see what will befall their master. Mark's gospel tells what happens next. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, there came one of the maidservants of the high priest. And when she saw Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "And you also were with Jesus of Nazareth." But he denied, saying, "I do not know or understand what you are saying." And he went out onto the porch, and a cock crowed. And a maidservant saw him again, and began to say to those who stood by, "This is one of them." And he denied it again. And a little after, they who stood by said again to Peter, "Surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech shows it." But he began to curse and swear, "I don't know this man you're talking about." And the second time the cock crowed. And Peter called to mind the word that Jesus said to him, "Before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And when he thought of it, he wept. Mark 14:66-72. Peter's third and final denial is an oath. Not a solemn oath like God's affirmation to Abraham, but a profane outburst. Like God's oath, however, Peter's is confirmation of a fact, that fact being the weakness of Peter's will under the crushing weight of fear. As John's Gospel tells it, during one of Jesus' appearances to the disciples after his resurrection, Peter retracts his denial by declaring his love for Jesus exactly 3 times. So when they had eaten, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my lambs." He said to him again the second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He said to him, "Feed my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?" Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep." John 21:15-17. A mild form of oath in the New Testament is "God knows this or that," or "God is witness that this or that is the case." So when Peter attributes divine omniscience to Jesus, and then says that Jesus knows of Peter's love, it qualifies as an oath. Jesus has prompted Peter to reverse his denial point for point. Look at the questions and responses in the dialogue sorted from the surrounding text and listed. Notice that each group conforms to the pair plus 1 pattern we've observed in groups of witnesses. In each trio of statements, one stands apart from the other 2, which are so nearly identical in the original Greek that they can be translated identically in English. So, repeating a pronouncement twice or 3 times does confirm it, biblically speaking. Keeping in mind what we've discovered, return to the pivotal moment in the vision on the mountain when the voice declares Jesus to be God's beloved Son. That event is not the first of its kind in the Gospels. A similar declaration was heard when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee, and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And immediately coming up out of the water, he saw the heavens opened, and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. And there came a voice from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Mark 1, 9-11. Like the transfiguration, the supernatural effects that accompanied Jesus' baptism amounted to a waking vision. Comparing information from all four Gospels, it's not clear that anyone witnessed the dove descending or heard the voice, except for Jesus himself and John the Baptist. According to the fourth Gospel, John the Baptist related the vision to his followers, some of whom became disciples of Jesus. The similarities between the supernatural declarations at the baptism and later on the mountain are apparent when we put them next to each other. The wording varies slightly among the synoptic Gospels, but the gist is the same in all of them. The double testimony is what, by now, we should expect: an original pronouncement and a confirming repetition. That's where the synoptics leave it. But the principle is 2 or 3, and John's Gospel has something to add. The baptism was at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the transfiguration approximately in the middle. His ministry concluded with a fateful visit to Jerusalem, where Jesus taught at the temple for several days before his arrest and execution. It's during that final week of ministry, and in response to a prayer of Jesus, that the divine voice speaks for the third and last time. "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. But for this cause I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then there came a voice from heaven, "I have both glorified it and will glorify it again." The people therefore that stood by and were listening said that it thundered. Others said, "An angel spoke to him." Jesus answered and said, "This voice occurred not for my sake, but for yours." John 12, 27-30. Despite the differences between this declaration and those in the synoptic Gospels, all three witness to the divine sonship of Jesus. Those in the synoptics allude to Psalm 2, verse 7, in which God says to the Messiah, "You are my son." The one in John recalls Psalm 89, verse 26, which says that the Messiah will call out to God as his Father. When Jesus does just that, in the passage in John 12, the celestial voice answers, confirming the Father-Son relationship. Here are the three instances together. The pattern is easy to see. The synoptic declarations form an obvious pair in contrast to the distinctive instance in John. These are the only places in the Gospels where God speaks directly, so we can't be accused of biased selection. Mysteriously, the pattern stretches across the synoptic Gospels plus John. Yet by comparison with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John contains such a different assortment of sayings and deeds of Jesus that no one can plausibly speculate about a collaboration between John's author and the synoptic evangelists. One of the 20th century's premier biblical scholars, Ernst Käsemann, went so far as to claim that each of the New Testament Gospels is intended to be read independently of any others. Bart Ehrman, a preeminent scholar of the present, vigorously argues the same point. It doesn't take a scholar to reach that conclusion, just an attentive reader who doesn't unwittingly blend the Gospels out of habit. At the level of ordinary analysis, that is, judging from the surface, Käsemann and Ehrman are right. But Christian readers believe that at an underlying spiritual level, The Gospels are complementary of one another, forming a unified whole. We've been able to glimpse an aspect of that unity that makes literary sense and has no obvious natural explanation. Unless it's mere coincidence. Although mere is not the best word for a coincidence of these proportions. The biggest surprises are yet to come as we continue with the principle of confirmed testimony in the next video. I'll begin that study by sharing some thoughts on the relationship between faith and evidence. So please, join me again as Typologetics takes us deeper into the Bible. For more information, go to our website, typologetics.com, or visit the Typologetics Facebook page. Starting in the summer of 2016, you'll be able to support us on Patreon.